Good morning. Welcome to another fantastic week of leadership development and education online. And we have a brilliant session for you today. We have a formidable Andy Buck discussing leadership matters, not just the content within his book, but actually the essence of why he does what he does, and sharing with you some top tips and information about how we move our leadership forward into the landscape that we have before us. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, and I know just saying hi to some of you before the session went live, now you're from all over. We've got people from Manila, we've got people from Sydney, we've got people from the States and all over the UK. We can't thank you enough. We really can't thank you enough for all the support and dedication that you've given us over the last couple of months during the lockdown. We may have helped you, but you certainly have helped us in giving us a focus and delivering to you CPD at a time when it's been difficult to get hold of regular, good quality CPD. So thank you so much for your support and all the feedback that you've given us as well. It's really helped us fine tune the things that we're doing and kept the things that you've liked and changed the things that you've said you wanted to have different. So that's us up until today. We've got another 2 weeks, including today, of CPD for you, and we've got some announcements this week regarding what's coming next. So do stay tuned for that. We will be announcing it on Twitter and on here in terms of our plans for the future. On the Eventbrite, you will have seen there is a mailing list form for you. So if you haven't filled that in yet, please do go on there and do fill it in. I do not want to keep sending you emails. I know how many emails you receive, and it wouldn't be good to clutter up your email boxes any more than I need to. Today, don't forget, over on Twitter at Chiltern TSA, do join the conversation on there. Use the hashtag LDeduchat so we can find your comments. And one of the things I really would like you to do is share this with as many colleagues as you can moving forward. Those people that haven't found us, find a session that you really think they will like and share it with them. Get them to subscribe so they can stay up to date with the content as you have been. That just leaves me with his video to start off with. Let's jump straight in, and I'll see you after the video.
So thank you very much for inviting me along today. Really looking forward to this. And amazing how all these online sessions have attracted so many viewers. Congratulations to everyone that's been involved. I thought I'd just start off by just saying a little bit about myself without going on about it. So I started off as a geography teacher, did the two big middle leadership roles in schools of head of department and head of year in a secondary context. Went on to become a deputy head and then did 2 stints of headship, totaling 13 years altogether in East London. Went to work at the National College for School Leadership, leading on London Challenge, Black Country Manchester Challenge, and then helping get into the white paper and pick up the great work of George Berwick and London Leadership Strategy of getting the concept of teaching schools, which was a huge privilege, massively challenging but great fun. So set that up, then went to work at United Learning as the managing director of all of the schools, and then 6 years ago decided I wanted to go right back to really being a teacher again and going back to school myself to some extent around leadership. So I went freelance, set up Leadership Matters, my own organisation, wrote a book, did all sorts of stuff around leadership, and I work with schools both in the UK and abroad on this, how do leaders make the biggest difference for young people. When I started that, of course, I really needed a framework, or what I believe these days we call a schema, for the curriculum of leadership. I was sort of hunting around for that. Whilst doing that, was also wrestling with Aristotle and his famous phrase, which, if I get right, is we are what we repeatedly do. In other words, excellence then is not an act, it's a habit. And it really got me thinking about, well, what are the habits that great leaders actually have? So let's dig into this a little bit, and I'm going to share with you the journey really that I went on. So if Aristotle is right about the importance of habit, I guess the first question we have to ask ourselves is, where exactly do your leadership habits lie? When I was researching this 6 years ago, I went on to Google Images and typed in leadership models, because I thought, we're looking for this schema, if you like, to think about it. And it turned out there were 76,000 pages of Google Images on leadership models. However, I was very lucky because I had at the time recently heard when I was working at United Learning, someone called Steve Radcliffe. Steve Radcliffe is someone who's grew up in Wigan, went to Oxford, worked for Procter and Gamble, and then in his 30s went over to the States, set up a business there. But in his latter 20 years or so, it has worked helping others with their leadership. He's got a very successful book called Leadership Plain and Simple. And most days when you type leadership into the UK Amazon website, his book comes out at the top, if not in the top 5 always. And I'm lucky enough to have Steve as an informal coach stroke mentor. I was meeting with him and I'd just read his book and we were talking things through. And I'm just going to share with you his model, because actually at the very highest level, at the simplest but without being simplistic level, Steve Radcliffe's model for leadership really is plain and simple, but it really does the trick. So what he says is that leaders really only do 3 things, just 3 things. Number 1, they think about the future. Where do they want to go with their leadership? What is it that they're trying to achieve? What is the vision that they want to create that's driven by the purpose inside them that is their kind of driving force? If you haven't got a vision as a leader, there's only so far you'll get, he will argue. You know, when he was looking at writing the book and being faced with that sort of blank sheet of paper, he asked himself, well, what is it that are the features of the leaders that have really impressed him, really seemed to be making the biggest difference? And he said, well, it wasn't to do with their personality type or anything like that. It was, to use his vernacular, they were people that were up to something, that they kind of got an aspiration, they'd got something they cared about, and they were just doing everything it took to get there. So that's why having something to aim for is so important in leadership, because he was sort of saying that with these people, when you've got that future clarity, then things automatically sort of just happen around you. But of course, this is about leadership. It's not about doing everything. So the second element of his model is great leadership is about leaders engaging others to want to go with you, if you like, to that journey to the promised land. And that's about having clarity about what you're doing, but also about selling that future, getting people bought in, if you like, to where you want to go. And that's not just about good communication, it's also about really listening to people. It's about adapting what you say and how you say it to suit your audience, and so on and so on. The kind of ethos, logos, pathos that again Aristotle taught us around making a personal connection and establishing your character and your credibility. The ethos, and then the logos is thinking about, well, what's my logical argument for why this is important, but then also the pathos, which of course is the root of our word empathy, is making that personal connection with people too. So that's the second stage, getting people wanting to come with you, getting them engaged, getting them bought in, getting them excited, frankly. And then finally, of course, it has to be about delivery. There is no point in having all of the first 2 if in the end you don't actually deliver anything. So that can be some quite boring stuff. Delivery is all about planning, it's about holding people to account, it's about clarity of roles, it's just about making sure that we're clear about what we're doing and everyone's playing their part to the very high standard that we expect. I was very taken with this because of its simplicity. And actually, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, there isn't anything that I can think of that I've ever done as a leader or I've ever admired in other leaders that doesn't really come into one of these 3 categories. But I thought, it's important to kind of test this, because this is a generic leadership model. It's not one designed for education, although I happen to think it works very well. And asking ourselves this question, well, how applicable is this model to education? I think it's important. And I'd like to take us back to a bit of research that goes back to 2009. That was commissioned and conducted by the National College for School Leadership, as it was then, sadly no longer with us. And the likes of Alma Harris and team created a very strong piece of research at the time. It was well publicised and pretty well regarded, called 7 Strong Claims About Successful School Leadership. And the first 2 of those claims I think are interesting. Claim number 1, school leadership is second only to classroom teaching as an influence on pupil learning. That's a pretty bold and was seen at the time as a pretty controversial claim, but one that's been probably more widely than any other quoted from that initial publication in 2009. The second claim, though, is interesting, which is that almost all successful leaders draw on the same repertoire of basic leadership practices. Okay, so that would be interesting to sort of have a bit of an idea about what they are, and I'll come to that in a minute. But before I do, what's been really interesting about this piece of work, which is over 10 years old, is that just last year in 2019, 10 years on, they revisited it in the light of new research and evidence that had emerged. They revised the first claim. School leadership has a significant effect on features of the school organisation, which positively influences the quality of teaching and learning. While moderate in size, this leadership effect is vital to the success of most improvement efforts. So they've slightly, I would argue, downplayed the importance of leadership in the success of schools, but they're nonetheless very clear that it makes a difference. Obviously, the most important thing is what's going on in classrooms, but leadership clarity around what that looks like, of course, is going to be important, and helping teachers keep getting better, as we'll come back to later, is fundamental to that. The second claim, though, remained the same. Almost all successful leaders draw on the same repertoire of basic leadership practices. So let's just take a look at what those practices are then. So this is from that research, from Kenneth Leithwood, Alma Harris and others. And you'll see that there are those 4 domains of practice. But on the right-hand side, you've got the specific leadership practices. And the asterisks on here are really just about how this particular research relates to another piece of research, which I'm not going to explore today. But if you look, you'll see there that there are things like building the shared vision, identifying specific shared short-term goals. So it's not just the future in the long term, it's also what we want to achieve in the medium and short term, high expectations, and communicating that vision and goal very clearly, and so on. Now, I don't know if you're noticing this, but what it became very clear to me in this is that actually, as you look at those domains of practice, if you look at the things that are on the right-hand side there that school leaders, particularly heads, do, well, that top bunch, very, very similar to Steve Radcliffe's future. Building relationships and developing people is very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar to this sense of getting engagement. Building trusting relationships with and among staff, students and parents, for example, is all about engagement. Establishing productive working relationships with teacher federation representatives and so on. It's all about getting buy-in and engagement with where you're trying to go. And then the last 2 sections around developing the organisation to support what you want to achieve and to improve the instructional programme, the quality of the teaching, if we translate that, well, that's all very much about delivery. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but when I was thinking then about the schema and the model upon which I wanted to develop my own work, Future Engaged Delivery was really helpful. But I also came across this. I had the privilege of spending a week on a high-performing leadership program run by Oxford Side Business School at University of Oxford. And the model that was underpinning that week was this one, from someone called David Pendleton, who was the program director. And he basically said that leaders do 3 things, and they're represented by these 3 circles. And the 3 things are set strategic direction, which I think you'd agree is pretty similar to future. Build and sustain relationships, not that different from engage. And deliver results and get things done is pretty much identical. But what I love about this model is it doesn't see those 3 leadership domains in isolation, because the real world's not like that. It sees them as overlapping. And so if we think about the link between strategic direction and delivering results, the theory goes like this, basically. You can have a set of high-level strategic objectives, but unless you translate that into something concrete, unless you're well organized, unless you make that bridge between the theory and the practice, if you like, unless you're planned and organized, you won't get such good delivery. If we go to the other side and build and sustain relationships, schools are no different here. You can have a bunch of teachers and support staff who get on with each other really, really well. But unless they as a group, thinking about strategic direction, unless they know about the strategic direction, understand the strategic direction, and perhaps most importantly of all, care about that strategic direction, unless that is true, you won't get such good buy-in. And that's all about you creating alignment as a leader. And finally, If we look at the last section of this, if all of those other things are in place, this is about remembering your job is not to do everything. You're not, as a leader, teaching every lesson in your school or in your department or in your team, your year team, whatever, your phase in a primary or special school. You are not doing everything yourself. Your job is to empower others, is to play to their strengths, is to delegate. In other words, your job is to enable great teamwork to happen. Let's think about this a slightly different way. The blue circle is all about the logic of your strategy, from the head, if you like. The red is all about winning the hearts and minds, and the green is all about rolling your sleeves up and making stuff happen. The other reason I really like this model is because there are a couple of hidden axes. So from top to bottom, that's really a focus on the future, whereas at the bottom this is much more about the here and now. Whereas going left to right, the right-hand side of this diagram is really much more about people, whereas on the left-hand side, it's much more about getting stuff done. And I think that's a really helpful model, actually, because when I think about myself as a middle leader, well, even when I was ahead, to be honest, it often felt like most days when I reflected back on the day that I would have been dragged to the left and dragged to the bottom. And great leadership is about having a good balance across all of these, isn't it? Is making time to step back from the day-to-day and think about the future. And is making time to resist the temptation just to do everything yourself because, let's be honest, it'd be quicker and easier and better if you just did everything. It's resisting the temptation to do that and to try and move to the right, build the relationships, get people bought in and enable teamwork to happen. And of course, as individuals, we're all different. Some of you listening to this will be natural planners and organisers. Others of you won't. If you're someone who, when it comes to thinking about going on holiday, let's look forward to that day. You probably, some of you will have lists and, some of you may even have spreadsheets for how that works. Others of you will sort of pack last minute and think, well, if I haven't got it, I'll buy it at the airport. So we're all different. When it comes to, enabling teamwork, some of you will be very good at delegating and letting go of things. And others, as I was saying, will just be thinking, no, I'll just do this myself. It'll be quicker, it'll be easier, it'll be better. But the second thing that's really important here is not just understanding yourself, is also understanding, well, what's the situation that I'm in here as a leader? What do the people that I'm working with, what does the performance that is currently going on in the team or in the school, what's that like? Because that has a bearing as well on this, which is your approach or your leadership style, which is all about how you tackle things, which might be about where in those 6 domains do I need to focus. But also, if I was setting strategic direction, for example, and needing to make more time for that, well, there are different ways of doing it, aren't there? That can be quite top-down, or it can be much more bottom-up. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think it draws on some of the thinking that was in David Weston's piece for this series of online leadership inputs, which I enjoyed very much, but that tension that exists we'll return to a little bit later. The third model I'd like to share with you is this one from the Corporate Leadership Council. It goes back to 2004, and it says that our leadership, whatever role we're in, the good news is it makes a difference to results. And, in the school context, I'm not just talking about exam results here. I'm talking about the children that we send out into the world, in the broadest of senses. But there is a big gap between our leadership and those results or those outcomes. Why? Well, because other people are involved. They're in that gap. What we can say, though, if this model is to be believed, and I really like this, is that what we can say our leadership achieves is a very strong culture. Typically I would define culture as what we do, or the way we do things around here. Is what I would see if I came to your school and had a look at what was going on in lessons around the school, on the website. It's everything that actually happens. It's the stuff that happens. And I just used to think that was the job of leaders, get everyone doing really good stuff, based on good research, using really good models and so on, consistently well for every class, every child, every curriculum area. But actually our leadership creates something else as well. Our leadership also creates how it feels to work in a school, what's known as the climate. And that's important too, isn't it? Because I'm sure, we all know what it feels like when we feel unappreciated or when things aren't clear. We start to care less. And when we care less, the culture, these influence each other. A strong culture can breed a strong climate, but the reverse is true too. When these things are firing in the right direction, they will give you what's known as the discretionary effort within a team or an organisation, how much people are going the extra mile. And this is not about working longer hours. This is about people caring about what they do, as I was saying earlier, so that they want to keep getting better every single day. That's what great leadership does. It enables people to feel they can and want to keep getting better every single day. The other thing about culture and climate, if you get it right, is it means people stay, and that's really important too. We don't have a recruitment crisis in our country, but we do in the UK have a retention crisis, I would argue. Data out again recently saying that within 5 years, 1/3 of teachers have left. Here's some research from 2016 looking at this question, and I think you can see that when people are engaged, clearly their decisions about staying in the profession and seriously thinking about leaving with a destination in mind are very different from when they're disengaged. Looking at this a different way, I guess what we want is people to be on that blue line, doing things because they want to, not because they have to. Well, how much is that down to leaders? Well, in some research by Folkman, quite a lot, he would argue. That correlation between how effective you are as a leader and how engaged staff are is pretty clear, isn't it? It's down to us as leaders. Yes, of course, there will be individual variations with individual people within a team or a school, but when we look at it in the bigger picture, that's the effect. So if we pull all of that together, you've got what I call the Leadership Matters model, which is the title of this talk. So leadership starts with us understanding ourselves, knowing what are we good at, what are we not so good at, and what can we do about that. But it's also about us understanding our context, the people we're working with and the performance. And then using those two things to think, well, what do I need to do? What are the actions that I need to take? And that's very much, those 6 domains or the 3 domains, future, engage, deliver. What am I going to do? But it's not just what we do, it's also the way we do it that matters too. And if you get those right, you build that strong culture and climate, you'll build the discretionary effort, and you'll get the results that you want. So let's just focus on leadership actions for a moment. What is it that leaders do? Well, I'd argue there are kind of 2 big domains. One is what I would call behavioural competencies. These are the things that you do as a leader, that are your habits, if you like. Running a good meeting, building relationships with people, having a difficult conversation, planning. These are all skills that you have or competencies that you have that enable you to be a very good leader. Whatever job you're doing, you need to have a whole bunch of competencies like that. But there are also what I would call technical competencies. These are things that you just need to know how to do. So those behavioural competencies, I would argue, apply to all roles, but the technical competencies apply to specific roles. So they're where the behavioural habits sit, I would argue. They're in those 6 domains, aren't they? Creating teamwork is a generic habit. There are things you can do as a leader that will build teamwork and help effective teams to work. There are things you can do through the way you influence, for example, that will create alignment. They're all, if you like, generic leadership qualities that are really important, or habits that are really important. But let's take headship, for example. There is a whole bunch of technical knowledge that you need to have in order to be an effective leader. If you don't know stuff, then it's going to be difficult. And there's a list of, just some of the things that to be a great head, you need to be able to do. So I recently wrote an article for the Chartered College for Teaching's Impact Journal, where I tried to kind of set this out really. And I identified that this is a slightly different version of the model, but if we think about the different leadership roles that exist within the system, I think there are those 2 realms existing. So there's the leadership knowledge and role-related expertise that I've just been talking about. And then you've got the kind of personal qualities and universal leadership skills that run alongside that. So for a middle leader, you need to know some stuff to be a good middle leader. You need to know about what good teaching looks like. You need to know how to plan a curriculum, for example. As you become a senior leader, there are other things that you might need to know. And we were looking at head teacher, there's things there about HR and so on. So as you move up or progress through leadership roles, there's more stuff that you need to know. I would argue to be a system leader, you probably don't need to know all of the grassroots stuff. I'm yet to see a head teacher who doesn't know how to be a really good teacher. But I think for system leaders who are running groups of schools, that's not necessarily an essential item. That's a debatable point which people may want to pick up on. But so that's realm 1, which is a bunch of knowledge, specific stuff you need to know to be able to do that job well. And that needs to be evidence informed, it needs to be clear, and everyone needs to understand it. Then you've got the personal qualities and universal leadership skills, really represented by those 2 blocks. Now, what I would argue is that as a middle leader, you need all of those, and you're going to be operating in a relatively small sphere of influence, which is the team that you're leading. As you get promoted, those personal qualities and universal leadership skills don't really change. What changes is the sphere of influence, and that's how I would argue the thing progresses. So there's a visual representation of what I'm trying to talk about here. In reality, though, I suspect that this distinction between the behavioural and the technical competencies is less clear. And just to illustrate this, we're going to just have a quick look at the work of Vivienne Robinson, who was asked by the New Zealand government to just do some work on what is it that the best leaders do that makes the biggest difference, not to culture or climate, but to outcomes for young people. And these are the 5 things they identified: ensuring good behaviour and safety, resourcing, spending your money on doing the right things, real clarity of goals and expectations. So what are we trying to achieve, and what's the standards that we expect? Good planning, monitoring and evaluation. And finally, this big one, which has got twice the effect size of the next nearest neighbour, leaders spending time supporting teacher development. The fundamental thing that leaders can do to make the biggest difference to people outcomes is help teachers be better teachers. So if you look at that list of things, well, are they leadership competencies, or are they technical things that you need to be able to do, either generic skills or technical? Well, there are bits of both in quite a few of those, if you think about it. I mean, ensuring good behaviour and safety, you need to have some real clarity around what does the evidence and research say about how to run a good school and create a climate for learning that's really positive. And there's a lot of stuff out there on this. But you've also got to have the interpersonal skills to be able to put that into operation. You know, you can know the theory, but if you can't actually demonstrate that in practice, because, you know, behaviour and safety is a great example. It's about relationship. A fundamental part of it is about relationship, and that's a much more of a generic skill. Same thing with planning, monitoring and evaluating. There are some generic skills about planning that people need to have, but planning to do what? Well, we need to know stuff. We need to be planning to do the right things. So again, it's not as clear as all that in reality, potentially. Okay, so let's just have a bit of a recap of where we've got to so far. Number 1, leadership does matter. There's evidence to show that it makes a difference, albeit the claim that leadership is the second most important thing other than teaching has perhaps been downplayed slightly. It's nonetheless still very, very important. We've looked at this concept of the 2 domains of leadership, the first being around the specific domain, specific knowledge that you need to have in order to be able to do any particular job in a school, the stuff you kind of just need to know. What does best practice look like in this particular area? But also the generic skills that whatever leadership role you have, you need to be able to build relationships, you need to be able to plan. All those sorts of generic skills are important as well. And in the real world, I think, you know, there's a blur. Those things inevitably overlap, as the work of Vivienne Robinson showed us with the 5 key things. So, you know, creating that great behaviour environment, spending your money on doing the right things, having clarity around your goals and expectations, the planning and monitoring and evaluation of what you're doing, and then, of course, that final most important thing that leaders can do, which is to support teacher development, to help teachers become better teachers. And David Weston, in an earlier one of these online talks, raised, I thought, a really interesting and powerful question, which is, you know, something that all leaders grapple with, which is that tension between giving people autonomy, which is motivating, but runs the risk of them doing rubbish stuff, with if you like, at the other extreme of that, micromanaging people. So there's real clarity about what needs to be done, but people feel that they've got no chance to make things their own, and that can be quite demotivating. So working out, navigating, if you like, the challenges of how to do that is and can be very, very difficult. So I've got a few thoughts on that I thought I would share with you. So let's come back to the Leadership Matters model. And where we're really interested in having a look then is not at what you do, your leadership actions, but at your leadership approach. And there's no better bit of work on this, I think, than something that's over 20 years old now, but it's really stood the test of time for me, which is Daniel Goleman's work around, you know, Daniel Goleman, famed for his work on emotional intelligence, but also for his work on leadership styles. And he identified that there were basically 6 leadership styles that we use. The first is what he calls the visionary leadership style. This is when you're in the mode of painting the big picture of the promised land, if you like, and, you know, come with me to this amazing place. Not specifically, but very clear about what the destination is, but not so clear about exactly how we're going to get there. That's the visionary leadership style. Then he talked about the affiliative leadership style, which is the focus on building relationships, about removing conflict, getting everyone getting along nicely. When it comes then to thinking about how you engage with others and delegate and enable teamwork to happen, If you're in a directive mode, that's where you might be delegating and saying to someone, look, this is what I'd like you to do, and you're quite precise in the way that you ask them to do it. It's sometimes called coercive as a leadership style too. Done badly, it's micromanaging. Done well, it gives people the clarity they need to do what they need to do. The next leadership style is quite similar. It's the other side of the coin, really. It's called pace setting. This is where you say to someone, look at me, do what I'm doing, do it as well as me, keep up with me. That's the pace element to it. So rather than telling someone what to do, you're really sort of showing them or modeling what you want them to do. Exhausting, but nonetheless quite effective if you want to show people what change can look like, and you need to get change happening fast. Of course, when you delegate tasks, sometimes what you might do is be more democratic. In other words, you might be saying to someone, look, this is what I'd like you to do, or you might even be saying to them, what would you like to do to contribute to where we're trying to go, giving them the decision to even decide that. But either way, when they're working on something, you might say, look, you decide how you're going to do it. So long as you come up with the goods, I'm going to trust you to do that. So that's much more of a democratic style where you give away some of your decision-making power and empower others to make decisions. And then finally, you've got the coaching leadership style. This is where you're really asking questions of someone to help them work out what they want to do in order to be effective in their role and their leadership role. And Daniel Goleman argues that we need all 6 of these. If we think about golf and having a set of golf clubs, you kind of need all 6 golf clubs in your leadership golf bag if you're going to be effective. The question is, of course, when do you play each club? And that's going to depend a lot on what does the person or the people need, and what is the context, what's the performance like, how much time have we got? Those will all influence which golf club you need to pick or which leadership style you need to use. However, his research also found that on average, over time, if leaders tend to use some of these leadership styles more than others without realizing, if their default leadership mode is 1 or 2 of these in particular, they can start to have a negative effect on climate, a negative effect on how people feel. 2 of them particularly will have a negative effect if you overuse them without realizing. In other words, you're not using these golf clubs because they're what the shot requires. You're just using them because that's what you like to use without even thinking about it. So here's what the data says. So this is not effect size. I think this is correlation on questionnaire data. But those 4 you can pretty safely use. Those 2, if you overuse them, can start to have a negative effect on how people feel. And it's not surprising, is it? Because if you're constantly, this goes back to David Weston's tension before, if you're constantly telling or showing people what to do, after a while they get fed up, either because they think you don't trust them and you're not doing a good job and that's why you keep telling them, or because you don't seem to have noticed that they are doing a good job and you're carrying on doing it and they start to think, for goodness sake, stop micromanaging me. Either way, it's not good. So here's a slide that really kind of summarizes what is each style, when might you tend to want to use it, and a reminder of those correlations. So there you go then. That's all you need to do, is just to use that. Well, here's a little bit of help. I tend to think that with individuals, teams, or whole organizations, they kind of go through 3 stages. Number 1 is the sort of securing the base, getting the foundations in place, or potentially sorting out the chaos that you've inherited as a leader, whichever it is. And then as things improve, as the team or the organization gets better, you're looking to get to good, and then eventually you're going for great. You want it to be like amazing. Now, I would argue that using the visionary leadership style, painting that positive picture of the future, why wouldn't you want to use that in all 3 of those scenarios? Focusing on building relationships, creating harmony, removing disharmony, again, is very, very important. But when it comes to the other 4, I think the blend probably changes. When you're securing the base, you probably need a good dollop of pace setting and directive. That's what the situation requires, because you want to improve quickly and you need to give people clarity about what's required. And there will always, though, nonetheless, be an element with particular individuals or particular tasks where being more democratic and coaching is appropriate. But broadly speaking, as I'm sure you can imagine, as you get better as a team, an individual, or an organization, as a leader, your balance of those different leadership styles will shift. The other thing it's worth remembering, of course, is that for individuals, organizations, and teams, sometimes we go backwards too. Sometimes there are unexpected events, don't we know it, that can change things. If you're interested in reading more about this, Daniel Goleman's HBR article on this is really, really good. But I guess the question is, how do I make sure I'm always using the right golf club? In reality, you're not going to be sitting there thinking, right, now, hang on a minute, what were those 6 goal leadership styles? Which one do I need to use? I'm going to just share with you a bit of theory that I think will really help, a really pithy habit. I reckon that when you're having conversations with people, someone comes to you or you go to them to talk about something, there are only 3 types of conversation. The first, you end up with a job at the end of it. I call these the monkey on the shoulder conversations, where suddenly the thing that you've been talking about is down to you. Sometimes that's appropriate, but if that's your default mode as a leader, then you're not really leading, are you? Just doing other people's stuff. The direction of this arrow, by the way, is implying the frequency with which you should have these. Type 2 conversation is at the end of it, you're giving advice and they end up with the job, not you. I call these the wise owl conversations because that's about you with your wisdom and your greater experience helping others, and that's great. But the third type of conversation, the one that I would argue one should have more frequently of all, is where you just ask really great questions, at least to start with. I call these dolphin conversations for no other reason that I just wanted to keep the animal analogy going, if I'm honest with you. But here's the thing. I sort of realised, blimey, those 3 leadership conversations that you could have, they actually correlate with the Daniel Goleman's leadership styles, because when you end up with a job, you're sort of pace setting. When you're giving advice, you're being directive. And I didn't have his model in mind when I made up this model, but I realized retrospectively that actually, when you're asking questions, you're a blend of being democratic and coaching. And a bit like before, it's probably true to say that in all 3 of those conversations, focusing on the why and focusing on relationships is going to be important. I then realized the arrow was really going the wrong way. The arrow needs to be going that way. In other words, what I would be saying is that in order to have great conversations with people, you need to start those conversations by asking some questions. And then if you need to, if 7 out of 10 times, I reckon asking great questions at the beginning of conversations, you can help someone work out what they need to do for themselves. But on the occasions when you can't, well, then you can go into directive mode, give them some advice, go into pace setting mode, show them. That's absolutely fine. But you're not doing it as a kind of subconscious habit. You're doing it as a conscious decision, which means you're not putting a ceiling on someone else's ability to respond. And you can go backwards and forwards in a particular conversation like that without any trouble at all. So what's the basic habit here then that underpins this? Well, I think it goes like this. When you're starting a conversation, instead of offering advice or taking on a job, I will start by asking questions and only offer advice or take on a job as a conscious decision. And what's the benefit of that? So that I'm developing others and I have fewer operational tasks on my to-do list. Nice. And I'd just like to finish by sharing a bit of work that I've been doing more recently in COVID around how to have some of those conversations when you're asking questions. That's why I've written a book called Basic Coaching, or the Basic Coaching Method, and it has 4 elements to it. The first is thinking about what the structure of a conversation might look like. So you start off with a background, you then think about what does the person want to achieve, how are they going to achieve it at a high level, what do they need to actually do, and then finally, how committed are they to doing it? So those are what we call, or I call, the basic steps, and you'll see they spell out the word basic. But I don't think good conversations are just about the structure. They're also about, the way that you work with people. So building trust, keeping curious rather than judgmental, really showing empathy for the other person, and keeping positive as much as you can are the 4 big personal qualities that I explore. But also then the really important habits of asking first, framing your questions really, really well, keeping them as open as possible to start with, really listening hard, and then that great habit of playing back. Sounds like what you're saying is an incredibly powerful way of engaging thinking with individuals. And then finally, there's what I call basic feedback, which is about how to give feedback when you've observed something, and is particularly relevant when it comes to lesson observations, because you want to start a bit like asking first. You want to start by asking questions and making connections, but then not being afraid to feed forward and going into mentor mode, going into expert mode, sharing your knowledge, sharing the schema of how your school does stuff, and helping through modelling or explaining what someone needs to do in order to improve. So there we go. Asking first as being a really, really powerful habit for leaders is a great way of making sure that without even realizing it, you're kind of automatically using the right leadership style. I'm looking forward now to some of the questions, because this is the point where I go off being pre-recorded and we go live. And I'm sure questions have been coming in through the Q&A box on the online Zoom app, and look forward to seeing what you've all been coming up with.
Welcome back. I think people have just been so absorbed by what you were saying there, and obviously it makes so much sense. If anybody's read any of Andy's books, we ordered in bulk Leadership Matters 3 for the programs that we're running, knows that it makes a lot of sense and there's a lot of depth to the content that's within there. And that was a whistle-stop tour in terms of the background behind a lot of Andy's work, and obviously introducing his new book, which is Basic Coaching, which I'm really looking forward to having a read of. And the questions seem to be coming in now that people had time to digest what you said. So I'm just going to, without further ado, welcome Andy to the E stage.
Oh.
Welcome, Andy. Welcome to #LDeduchat.
I've got slightly less hair than in the last video.
Lockdown.
So,
pre-recorded.
Yeah, exactly.
So obviously questions have started coming through now. There was one that came through earlier on, and this was quite an interesting one, which I hadn't paid a lot of thought to be fair, because I think it's from Anna, who talked about how do we ensure the quality of leadership development given the decentralisation of training and proliferation of local offers. Is it a postcode lottery for developing leaders? It's quite an interesting one, especially with what's happened during lockdown in terms of has it been, is it, and will it be, in terms of a postcode lottery, in terms of the development and support that you get as a future leader, as a new leader, or a leader that simply wants to build their professional base.
I mean, the postcode element to this, I think, is interesting, because one of the things that I think we've learned in the last 3 months is that postcode perhaps matters slightly less than we thought. You know, we've got people here from postcodes all over the world engaging this morning, which is amazing. And if you're outside the UK, big welcome to you. I hope you found it useful. And I think, so therefore, I think it is the question we have to ask ourselves is the organisation or the person or the group of people that are offering a development opportunity, like having a sense of a checklist of what are the sorts of things you should be looking for. Number one, is there a proper schema for the thinking about leadership? Number two, is that evidence informed? Number three, is there a nice blend to that approach? So does it involve working with peers? Does it, where possible, involve deep reading or accessing of resources? Does it give you a chance to focus on doing something and then reflect on how successful you have been? The idea of having a kind of project built into what you're doing. I mean, one of the things I've been doing during COVID is designing a program for the National College of Education, who run apprenticeships, which are great thing about apprenticeship leadership development is it's free for schools. It's just a way of spending your apprenticeship levy. And so I went right back to thinking about, within the framework that you have to use for apprenticeships, but which is, by the way, a very good one because it believes in all of that blending, is making sure that all of those elements are there. So I guess it's really just asking yourself those questions and seeing whether or not what is on offer to you kind of stacks up, really, whether that's local with a Teaching School Alliance or within your own academy trust or local authority, or whether or not it's something that is more of a national program with organisations like Ambition School Leadership or the NCE or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think this lockdown that we've been in, it really has opened up horizons. I think the responsibility now, whereas it might have been with the schools to do with time and everything else, it really does lie with us now in terms of where we've found our CPD as leaders. I mean, just from a personal point of view, I'm talking to people that are not even in the UK, because I'm thinking, what do I need and who's the best person for that? And then I've found those people and opened up a conversation with those people. And it really is now delving deep and reflecting, I think, in terms of what you actually need and where's the best place to find it. Rather than just what's on offer. So other questions have been coming in.
Yeah, I think Peter's one is interesting in the context of leadership development around the use of 360 tools. So I'm a big fan of 360 tools. It's why we have one on the Leadership Matters website called LM360, because it's a really good way of you potentially seeing blind spots, things about your own leadership that maybe you're not aware of. The Johari window, that corner that says this is the stuff that other people know about me that I don't know about myself, which is, is clearly a danger for a leader. But I think you have to be very careful about the way you use 360 as well. And it's something I write about in the book. And we talk about a lot of Leadership Matters, because if 360 is used as a tool to judge, I think it's much less powerful than if it's used as a tool to help someone grow. So this is the difference, I guess, between leadership development and leadership appraisal, or performance management and performance development. So I very much welcome it being a tool that helps you as a leader, that you own the feedback that comes through 360. And the way the Leadership Matters 360 is designed is it doesn't compare you with any averages or with anyone else. It's just about you. So you can compare yourself with yourself again in the future and think, which links to the question that came up earlier about that, how do you measure the impact of leadership development? Well, one of the ways you can do it is look at people outcomes, of course, but there's obviously a big time lag, and it's quite often quite hard in education to isolate cause and effect. But actually, somewhere that's a bit more focused from that can be doing 360 and seeing what changes over time. So I thought that was interesting. Fiona was talking about how do you move from middle to senior leadership, and make that step. And for me, I'm sort of reflecting on my own journey a bit here, which is kind of, well, just offer to do something, just offer to take on a project that's school-wide once you've been a middle leader for a while. I mean, I don't think you should do it after 5 minutes, clearly. Build some credibility, build a bit of a track record, so people think, oh, okay, Fiona's worth having a listen to, and I trust her. I'll work with her on whatever this thing is. I'll go with her to that future that she seems interested in and get that engagement, and just do it and learn, but also signal to others that you're interested in doing it. And I think that helps transition. The other thing, and this again is where programs that are offered like the NCE or Ambition programs, that I mean, too often people get a job and then think about what's the training I need to do this. Whereas if you look at somewhere like the police force, and I'm not saying this is perfect by any means, but their system, you get your sergeant's ticket and have done the sergeant's training before you become a sergeant. Rather than the other way around. So, organizations, be it schools or groups of schools, being better at giving people leadership development that it prepares them for their next role rather than gives them what they need when they start. Just like with coaching, which, as you know, I'm a big fan of. I think when coaching is great is when it helps someone transition before they start a role, during the new role, and then into the beginnings of the new role. And I had coaching, when I went from moving from being a head to working at the National College, made a massive difference, because you're grieving your old role, you're coping with the challenges of the new one, and just having someone to talk about that who's not going to judge you, who's just going to challenge you but help you on that journey, I think it can be very powerful as well. Manuela's question on manager and leader difference, I think really it's recognizing you do need to do both. You can't be a good leader unless you can manage. And rather than separate it, leadership and management, I tend to think it's much more about those domains in David Pendleton's primary colours model, because a lot of the stuff you do in delivery actually is management, because within that is the planning element, being planned and organised. But so that would be my answer to that question. Were there any others that have come up through, because I've not been able to look at that box for a while?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, just wanted to say, Manuela's actually from Romania, so welcome to Manuela, and thank you for the question. I think Louisa's question, in terms of, I mean, it was really, really helpful, I think, to hear that having all six Goleman's 6 leadership styles. I think what we find as people that have worked for leaders and worked with leaders is that there seems to be a style that somebody prefers, rather than thinking it's a toolbox, and then it quite often taps into our own strengths as well. So if we like a coaching style leader, we necessarily have an affinity towards somebody who's that particular one. But what she said is, during this time, the directive style of leadership has been used much more, risk assessments, crisis planning. How can we restart in September when things are still unknown in a more democratic, natural leadership style, when coaching is harder within bubbles?
Well, that's such a good question. Yeah. I think the analysis, by the way, is absolutely spot on. And I think was right. If you're in a situation, you're in a room with a bunch of children and the fire alarm goes off, you're not going to say to the children or to the group of adults you're working with, right, in pairs, have a quick discussion about which exit you want to go through. You're going to be very directive, if not pace setting, and be the first one out the door. Follow me, everyone. And so I think that is what COVID required. It required people on behalf of everyone to become experts about what to do, to read the guidance, to understand the health and safety, to think about what do we know about online learning, which are the best tools to use, talk to people, do that, and then say to people, right, everyone, this is what we're doing. Because people didn't have the time or even the space to do that thinking. But it is a big challenge, and particularly as Louise is mentioning in bubbles, it makes it even more challenging. And I think probably I go back to what I was just saying in the film, which is just about trying to develop the habit as a leader. If you're a leader, develop this habit of just starting conversations by asking questions. Because what that does is it stops you limiting the other person's ability to know what they're doing, but it doesn't mean that you can't go into giving advice or being more direct if that's what's needed. But if you can just develop that habit, whether you're a head or a middle leader or a senior leader, of just asking questions. We do it, by the way, intuitively, brilliantly in the classroom. Child asks a question, we rarely just give them the answer, do we? It's in the DNA of every teacher to ask some questions to help the child work it out for themselves. And I guess really trying to develop that habit as adults post lockdown is going to be very, very helpful and very important. I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, I am going to just tap into a question that was asked over the weekend by somebody. Well, actually, there are 3 different people that have spoken to me. They're actually starting their headship in September, their first headship.
Wow.
And just kind of linking to that question there, and they've said to me, in terms of they've got a real fear of being defined by the current situation and leadership style that they feel that they must use. So that thing about standing above the trees, looking where the fire is and telling everybody to go in a different direction to what they feel on the ground. And they're saying, what can they do to make sure that they are not defined in terms of a leadership style by the current situation, which, like you said, people need direction at the moment, but that might be their defining.
Well, yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, there are people as well who have gone, I know I've coached some people who have gone into headship during COVID and lockdown, which again it presents a whole series of challenges. I think, the fact that those 4 individuals are asking that question, number one, is essential, because leadership is about having that self-awareness and understanding what's the context I'm in, as I was saying, know yourself, know your situation. And that indicates those people are doing both of those things. They're thinking about themselves and what they're likely to do, but they're also thinking about what's the situation that I'm in, which is powerful. But for me, I think this is about communication. I mean, so much of leadership is about communication. And I think sharing with people in that first staff meeting, when you've got everyone in the room, albeit socially distanced, whatever the rules are when the time comes, is saying to people, look, we're in a particular situation here. We're all going to have to work differently. I'm worried I'm going to be defined by this, and I don't want that to be the case, but I want to share with you that that's a worry. Now, leaders that are authentic and open about their worries, so long as they're not doing it every 5 minutes and people think, oh, blimey, they don't know what they're doing, I think that's healthy, because that shows they're human. I mean, Steve Mumby, in his wonderful book, Imperfect Leadership, I think gives lots of examples of, at the very highest level, of how even leaders like Steve, who I had the privilege of working with for a few years, are still humble and admit, when things are challenging them. But they're not falsely humble either, because there's nothing more irritating than someone says, well, it was nothing to do with me, it was all them. And that's not what you really think. So there needs to be an authenticity about that at the same time.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for another one question, perhaps. Have a look at Ben's question towards the top, which is more of a personal one in terms of experience of going back to just teaching, as in just teaching after being a leader for so long. I have taken 2 years out middle leadership as a key stage leader and wish to begin applying for similar leadership roles as before. Do you think do you think this time out of leadership will be an issue? So he's taken a break from leadership role and wants to go back into it now.
I don't think it'd be an issue at all, so long as you've kept engaging with this concept of leadership and what it is. In fact, sometimes just taking some time off the treadmill and reflecting is enormously helpful, and taking advantage of that, I think, is important. And if I draw my own experience, I mean, when I became a head in 1997, quite accidentally almost, because the head, I'd been a deputy head for 2 years, and the head took early retirement, and I knew I always wanted to be a head one day, but obviously I wasn't planning for it then. But a member of staff came to me and said, Andy, why don't you apply for the headship? And I was thinking, what? I've just been a deputy head 2 years. Then they added, in case you're the best there is, which is not the sort of ringing endorsement you're looking for in that situation, I have to be honest. But it did get me thinking, and I thought, well, look, I'll stick in an application. Long story short, I got the job, but there was no MPQH then. This is 1997. And I felt very ill-equipped, and it was tough. It was really tough. So I guess the first thing is to make sure you have engaged in training to get yourself up to speed, and you're really thinking yourself into the role, which sounds like you are anyway by just the fact you've asked that question. But secondly, if I go back to 6 years ago, I suddenly properly explored what leadership was because I needed to. And I realized a lot of the things I was doing, like why I was doing that. I didn't know what the theory was, or what the Viviane Robinson's research would be saying, or Steve Radcliffe would be saying, whatever. I was just sort of doing quite a lot of those things, sometimes quite intuitively. And I had thought hard about what teaching looked like, what good teaching looked like, and what good, creating a good climate for learning with behavior and so on looked like. So those things were all there, but I didn't have the framework within which to think about them. And so having that time out helped. And the last thing, I mean, I don't know whether Ben would say this is true for him, but there's something wonderfully nourishing about going back to the core job. And yes, okay, I'm working with adults mainly, although I do some leadership development work with young people. I'm mainly working with adults, although the age difference now is probably bigger than it was when I was a young teacher. But the sense of working with people to help them grow and develop that you have as a teacher is great, because don't forget, all teachers are leaders. It's one of the few professions you go in and you have to be a leader from the start. That's your space, that's your classroom, that's your learning space. You've got to go in there and lead it. Very few jobs where that's the case. So going back and leading in that context, I've certainly found very empowering, very nourishing. And when I was ahead, I spent 2 years where I didn't teach, then got a set of results that were not what I was expecting. And I remember ringing my mum and saying, "Mum, I don't know if I can do this anymore." And my mum said, "You might be right," which is like an interesting response from my mum, but was absolutely the right response, because if she just tried to say, "Oh, it'll be fine, Andy," that was ignoring the feelings I had at the time. So she said, "Look, don't decide now, wait till Christmas, but think about what is it that you perhaps need to get you through till Christmas." And I thought, well, I need to teach again. I need to run the school ski trip. I need to get involved again with the school shows. How amazing, by the way, is that £1.5 billion money for the arts that's just been announced yesterday? Because it's part of me and what gets me going. And we're back to that thing of what am I up to? What matters? And it's relationships with children doing fantastic things. So I don't know whether Ben's had a chance to do that. Sounds like he might have done. That hopefully has just got him going back in again, even more energized than he would have been if he'd stayed on the treadmill.
Absolutely. I mean, we never have enough time to answer all the questions. And we could spend hours, I think, discussing the topics that people want to discuss. But I think the session's really embodied in terms of, as leaders, future leaders or existing leaders, where we need to reconnect if we haven't. I think that's the challenge that we had over the last 3 months, is the fact that there's this feeling of isolation and a disconnect with the body that you're normally with in terms of the school and the staff and the students within that. So I think there is some healing time needed as well for leaders, in terms of to reconnect, to rebuild those relationships that may have weakened over time.
Absolutely. And if you think about that future engage deliver, the engagement is the bit in the middle that joins it. It's at the heart. It's absolutely the heart of it. So I completely agree. Absolutely.
So thank you for today's session, Andy. Brilliant session. The time just whizzes by. That hour just
yeah.
So thank you so much for putting the presentation together. And there have been a couple of questions to do with specific things to do with leadership matters, in terms of, can somebody have 360 review on an individual basis, and etc. I don't mind you staying on. I think that was Erica Cherry who asked that question, if you wanted to just type the answer to that while I wrap up. And when is your book out, by the way? The basic coaching is out now, isn't it?
It's out now.
Yeah,
If anyone's got any follow-up questions, andy@honk.org.uk, just email me. Very happy to, rather than worrying about the chat, just email me. I'm very happy to enter into dialogue about anything. andy@honk.org.uk.
Brilliant. And on Twitter, don't forget, I have tweeted Andy's handle, and also LM Matters as well, in terms of the organisation Leadership Matters. So from that point of view, do find him. And if you do need his email address and you've forgotten to write that down, and just email me or Claire and we'll send you his details out. So thank you, Andy, again. And this is the end of another session of #LDeduchat. What a way to start the week. Andy Buck with Leadership Matters, leading off a fantastic week of CPD for you. Tomorrow we have Gamal Yafai talking about inclusive leadership and why should anyone be led by you. And Wednesday we go into SEND, and we have Anita Davey looking at outstanding provision. Thursday we have Sabrina Francis, who's from Mindset Match, looking at resilience within from a management of mindset. And then on Friday we end the week with Tom Rogers of Rogers History, looking at how do we maximize progress within the history classroom. A varied mix. There should be something for everybody there. And do jump onto our Eventbrite. I have put all the links for all the pre-recorded sessions now on the homepage for you. So you can hook straight into those. My challenge to you, don't forget, was to see if you can find a colleague that hasn't found us yet and share a session that you really enjoyed that you feel would be beneficial to them. And a secondary challenge, I still haven't got anybody from France. I need to have somebody from France. So if you've got a teacher colleague in France, they've now got 8 opportunities left to join us. And I need to fill that gap with France being part of hashtag LDeduchat. So this is me, Arv Cowshaw, for another session of hashtag LDeduchat, Leadership Development and Education Online. Signing off, and see you soon. Thank you.